A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillah ar-Rahmanir Rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I ask Allah's forgiveness for any errors that I might make due to the frailty of being human. It's been a little while since we had the friends along the way. Not only did we all go through Ramadan, but I moved house, and my house, although it is amazing, the one that I'm renting was in sort of like deteriorating circumstances. So I did a lot of work to kind of get it up, and they kind of like caused me a little bit of confusion. So I wasn't able to do a lot of events for this Patreon page, and now I'm back for a little while. I want to introduce our friend along the way before we talk about her book. Katrina Thompson is FAW2 Bascom Professor of Humanities and Professor of African Cultural Studies at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where they also have an affiliation in religious studies, anthropology, gender and women's studies. They have conducted ethnographic research on language, gender, and sexuality among Swahili-speaking Muslims in Tanzania, and more recently, non-conformist Muslims in North America and in online groups. Muslims on the Margins is their third ethnographic monograph. I like to hold up the book when I am first talking about it, but I only have the electronic version.
I can hold up my copy.
There we go. There we go. Creating queer religious, hold it up again. Sorry, I want to read this subtitle. Creating queer religious community in North America. I am fascinated by this topic, by personal engagement, but also I am really excited to talk to Dr. Thompson about their monograph, because I'm a humanities person, so I'm always dealing in abstract, terms, and this book was very, very immersed in what we call the lived realities, and so I found it really exciting. I found some things were very, very new for me in terms of sort of understanding how to make an analysis. So I look forward to talking more about it in depth. I am going to give Dr. Thompson an opportunity to introduce her lovely self and talk a little bit about their project in bringing this monograph to fruition. So, Dr. Thompson, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wadud. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. So I'll start by talking a little bit about my background. I converted to Islam in 2009 mostly through relationships with families in Zanzibar, where I had been conducting research prior to that. And Zanzibar, as your listeners may or may not know, is a predominantly Muslim island off the coast of Tanzania and part of Tanzania. And I was living in Los Angeles at that time. I was teaching at UCLA. The family that I had been kind of adopted by in Zanzibar had a very conservative approach to Islam. So even though I was very interested in Islam, I knew that I did not want to practice Islam in the way that they did. And so I started doing a lot of research, just Googling things like Islam and feminism, and quickly found your work and related work, and was really pleased to learn that there was such a vibrant set of scholarship by Muslim feminists. And somehow that led me to Omid Safi's book, Progressive Muslims, which also has a chapter by you in it. And then I think there was a list of resources in the back that mentioned Muslims for Progressive Values. And that had been founded in Los Angeles. And so I Googled them and found a meeting, and went to that and just immediately felt like I had found my people. And so for the rest of the time that I was living in Los Angeles until 2013, I became very involved in MPV. Eventually was involved in leadership. For a little while, we had our own mosque that met on Fridays, and I had the chance to lead prayer, mixed gender prayer, and give sermons and so on. But when I left Los Angeles and moved to Madison in 2013, I never found the same kind of progressive Muslim community here that I had found in LA. So I became much more active in online groups. MPV has a very large Facebook group of, I think now there's about 20,000 people. Through Ani Zonneveld of MPV, I met El Farouk in Toronto and got involved in Al Tawhid Juma Circle. Sometimes attended their Friday prayers back when they were still on Skype. And just started to get involved in this really large, almost global network of progressive Muslims. Around the same time when I moved to Madison, my personal events made it difficult for me to go back to Zanzibar. And so I was looking for a new place to do research. And I also have young kids, so doing work in the United States and North America became more appealing to me for a number of years. So I decided to use these networks that I had developed with progressive Muslims in North America and in online groups to carve out this new project, which is looking at how people who are involved in these groups create community. Mostly through language. My research focus is in linguistic anthropology, so I'm interested in how people use language in their everyday lives to create their identities in relation to one another, to create community, to talk about their religious beliefs, their gender and sexuality, and so on. And so I started this very large scale project that took me about 6 years of doing ethnographic work in a number of MPV chapters around the US, as well as with Al Tawhid in Toronto, and in 3 online groups, the 2 that I've mentioned, as well as to a lesser extent, the Fitna group, the feminist Islamic thinkers of North America. So this book is looking at how Muslims who are involved in these groups create community that is kind of has a lot of similarities and kind of emerged from the progressive Muslim movement of the early 2000s, but has kind of moved beyond it to become more inclusive of LGBTQ Muslims that were a lot of people I spoke to who had been involved since those early days said that LGBTQ issues were mentioned at that time, but they never felt like they were fully included. And I think these more recent groups have really made a great deal of effort and had a great deal of success in being more inclusive of LGBTQ Muslims. But I'm also interested in how the inclusivity toward LGBTQ Muslims has kind of had the effect of queering these groups more broadly. So when I talk about queerness, I don't only mean LGBTQ Muslims, but also I think of the groups at large as queer in the sense that they're different from the norm, that they're anti-normative, that they're celebrating diversity and so on. And so I argue that even folks who are straight and cisgender who are involved in these groups have had their interpretations of Islam kind of queered by their inclusivity toward LGBTQ Muslims. So I think I will pause there and see what questions you want to ask, but hopefully will let me tease out the other themes of the book.
Yes. Thank you so much. Also, it helps me to have a little bit more personal context because my greatest familiarity right now with you is through this book. And thank you, by the way, for sending me the electronic copy so that I could see it. I think when I'm back in the US, I'll try to get a hard copy so I can have it in my collection. life has become so virtual, sometimes I forget that hard copies are still necessary. And in fact, sometimes they're more convenient for somebody my age, especially. Yeah, so there's a couple themes that you have brought up that I would like to kind of flesh out a little bit. Because of linguistic anthropology, I think it'll be fun to sort of talk about some of the nuances. And I think one of the things that you described, here just now is sort of a progression, even in your own experiences with these groups. And that progression sometimes identifies itself through different terms. So I'm going to go with the one that was the most interesting to me, and that is that you choose consistently to use the term non-conformist. And I found it interesting because linguistically it's a negation. And so by being a negation, it seems to me to set up a normative understanding that, conformism is in fact a standard. I know when I published my second book, the editors put a little thing on the back where it says that she broke with tradition. And I said, no, I didn't break. I helped to create new traditions. So I'm always looking for ways to, think about the affirmation of something in itself rather than the negation of the norm that's out there. That's my sort of, you would say, organic and intuitive fearing that it's just the way that I look at language. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about that term, why you, feel so comfortable with it, what you uncover that makes you feel consistently that this is the term that you want to use with regard to these groups, and who do you think fits in to these groups? It's a big question, but it's a nice topic.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I struggled for a long time with the term. Initially, I started out just using progressive Muslim because that was how I self-identified. But I pretty quickly ran into trouble. Like even before I started the project, I had contacted Omid Safi to ask if he was willing to write a recommendation for me in a grant application that I was putting in to start the project. And he was pushing me to give a kind of a strict definition of progressive Muslim in the proposal. And he had his own definition that was kind of focused on social justice issues. And I felt like I wanted to keep that open. I wanted to find out how the people that I was talking with and the groups I was attending, how they thought about what it meant to be progressive Muslim. So I didn't want to start with a preconceived definition. But then it became difficult. Well, if I don't have any definition going in, then how do I know which groups to include or which people to reach out to invite to be involved in interviews and so on. So I started out with the groups that I was already familiar with, but I would always ask people to think about or to talk with me about what those terms meant to them, whether it was progressive in the case of MPV chapters or Tawheed in the case of Al Tawheed Jumma Circle. And I quickly learned that a lot of people have rejected the term progressive, that they found it difficult for various reasons, some because of kind of critiques of MPV as an organization, others because they had been involved with other progressive groups that, fell apart or had kind of internal struggles that they wanted to disidentify with. And others because they saw it as problematic in its suggestion, similar to what you were saying, like a movement away from something else, or that it might be seen as a critique of other Muslims who did not identify with that term. And so a lot of people said, they didn't want to use any label, they just called themselves Muslim. But for academic purposes, that was really problematic to not have any kind of term to attach to them. And Nobody used the term nonconformist that I spoke to. That's kind of my term that I'm applying, but it seemed to capture the array of terms that people did use, which I think all have the same issue that you're pointing to. They use terms like rebel, which implies, you're rebelling against something else. Misfit implies you don't fit in with the something else. Unorthodox. I never, I think in some ways the word progressive was better in that it didn't necessarily imply a negation of something else, although it still does imply some movement away from something else. But nonconformist, I guess it seems like everyone involved in these groups is, for the most part, is differentiating themselves from other types of Muslims. But I felt that this term did that without necessarily vilifying more traditional or more conservative Muslims. And so I found it useful. I think queer would have also served the same purpose, but for me, but has the problem that a lot of people read that and assume you're only talking about LGBTQ Muslims. And I think people have already made that mistake just reading the title of my book. I reached out to one colleague asking if he would participate in something about the book, and he works on issues related to Muslims in North America, and he said, oh, that's, your book is outside my area of expertise. And I was like, just because you don't work on LGBTQ issues doesn't mean this is outside of your area of expertise. So I think any of these terms is problematic for different reasons, but I hope that I kind of explain it in the book to help people understand why I'm using these particular terms.
Yeah, I think I'm just looking at my notes, and like everything has to do with the extent to which any one term can describe the complexities of any identity.
Exactly.
And I've kind of gravitated towards using inclusive because at any place where there is sort of a dichotomy, how do you get them to be reconciled? And I like inclusive and I like intersectional, but I also find that the use of intersectional usually highlights certain aspects of the intersection and leaves others out. And, in this book, you do talk about different ways in which those intersections or inclusions, work or don't work. And, you have like a substantial conversation about Shia inclusivity, especially in the context of North America, which is dominated by Sunni. And sometimes there are spaces and or groups and or initiatives that want to use the term Muslim, but actually what they mean is Muslims like us. And therefore, everyone else is actually not included and sometimes, sort of excluded, and that could be even quite aggressive. And I find that this is an issue I feel like we should always deal with, but I also feel like coming to accept ourselves as part of normative is important. I had a friend once who referred to an Eid service that they had done in the UK. And they said, it's just like a proper mosque. I said, as long as you're using that for the neoconservative, patriarchal, hegemonic, see how many words you have to use, if as long as you're using it for them, then it always puts us on the outside. So I also want to ask you about your use of an experience with marginalization. And I mean that not just in terms of its epistemology, but also in terms of your book focuses, very sensitively on Muslims' own identities, their own personal location, their own struggles within those identities. And often it is marked by an experience of being marginalized. Can you talk with us a little bit about that, you know, both in terms of the book and in terms of your experiences with these communities or yourself personally?
Yeah. Well, one distinction I try to make in the book is between being on the margins and being marginalized. So I think, you know, people who are have certain positionalities like LGBTQ Muslims, Shia Muslims, feminist Muslims, sometimes African American Muslims, Muslims with disabilities, and so on, can be marginalized in a variety of settings, whether that's, you know, not being allowed to lead prayer or not being allowed to give a sermon, not having physical access to the mosque, or, you know, in the case of women, having to go through a separate entrance or stay in a separate area. So those, I see all of those as forms of marginalization. But I tried to argue that some of the participants in my work are also on the margins, not because they themselves are marginalized, but because they've chosen to be involved in these groups where they are in solidarity with people who are marginalized. So they themselves might be cisgender, male, you know, Arabic speakers, Sunni, and so on. And so don't reside in any kind of positionality that would normally marginalize them within the Ummah, but have chosen to take up this position on the margins alongside others who are more marginalized than them. In my own personal experience, I would say I've been fairly privileged in that, you know, when I first converted, you know, in a lot of North American Muslim communities, there's this kind of fetishization of converts and, you know, being extremely welcoming, perhaps especially of white converts. And so I experienced some of that. I also, you know, was foreign to me to be somewhat foreign to me to be marginalized as a woman. You know, I was already a college professor when I converted. I'm used to being in positions of, you know, where I'm allowed to speak in front of the room and share space with men and consider them my equals and so on. And all of a sudden I was going into spaces where I was being told to sit in the back of the room and cover myself up and not being allowed to take up positions where I was speaking and so on. But that didn't last very long because I pretty quickly left those communities and kind of immersed myself in progressive Muslim communities, as I mentioned. Where I experienced that to some extent now is when I go back to Tanzania. I haven't had any very negative experiences, but I always have kind of a little bit of paranoia about not being welcome in spaces that are predominantly male, or whether I'm dressed modestly enough to you know, to satisfy what they believe is respectable. I've been sometimes not sure whether to even tell people that I'm Muslim, because, you know, if I'm not Muslim, it's okay that I'm not covering my hair, but if they know I am Muslim, then they have different expectations of me. So I don't know if I would exactly call that marginalization, but it's certainly a site of discomfort in my relationship with other Muslims. And I think the online groups have been a lifesaver for that kind of situation where, you know, here in Madison, as I mentioned, I don't have a Muslim community that I feel like is feminist and LGBTQ inclusive and so on. And so when I want to seek community with other Muslims, I'm able to do that through online spaces. And that was really a really fulfilling part of this research too, is that I got to travel around and visit friends who do have face-to-face communities, and, you know, spend time with friends in Toronto at El Tawhid, you know, at many different MPV chapters and so on, like before COVID, before COVID happened and I was still able to travel. I felt like that kind of rekindled my my faith to some extent, and certainly my sense of being part of a larger religious community.
Yes, the joy in your work does come through, the ways in which you sort of tease out how the interlocutors present themselves, and you have a very close camaraderie. You're not like voyeuristically looking down upon this little sort of bizarre group. You're actually engaged with them, and the conversations have a great deal of reciprocity and equality in the ways in which you present it. So I'm glad you mentioned that the project itself allowed you to sort of participate in these communities, because that does come through in your work. It's fun because of course I know many of the people that you were talking with. And, I kind of love the way that you introduce parts of them that maybe, I hadn't had an opportunity to meet. And also, you keep a very critical lens on, certain presumptions that are made with regard to the whole idea of inclusivity and the whole idea of queerness in the context of Islam and Muslims. So yeah, I mean, as far as the book goes, there's a lot for people to learn, and there is a great deal of sensitivity, I think, that's expressed. I try to, read and review things that are related to Muslims' self-expression of something beyond the hegemonic, heteronormative, patriarchal, conservative, authoritative version of Islam, which some people call the norm. But you do it very well, in the book, and it's easy to read, not in the sense of being oversimplistic, but in the sense at which it is very personable, and people come to life in the ways in which you let them present themselves, and yet you also do sort of a critical analysis, and you put things, on a kind of trajectory so that, I tell people that we are living in a generation of queer expression that will make history, because at no other time in Muslim history has queer self-expression been so adamant to claim its own identity and to present that identity through multiple forms, not just in terms of, writing books, but also in terms of art and other forms of expression, as well as, the topic that I think is most central here, and that is creating communities of sacred experience. Can you talk to me a little bit about the nature of the sacred experiences that you engaged in your interviews, but also in the context in which you did this work?
Yeah. So in the course of visiting these different groups, often I went to their Friday prayers in Atlanta and Toronto. I also visited Masjid Al Arabiya for their Friday prayers, although they weren't a formal part of the group. And MPV Chicago. And then I also attended the Columbus, Ohio Unity Mosque, which is affiliated both with El Tawhid and with MPV. I visited for one of their Eid prayers. And with Atlanta, I also went to, they had a couple of Ramadan retreats where we spent whole weekends together. So I would say more in the participant observation than in the interviews. We really, I really got us to observe how people are practicing Islam. And again, it's hard to talk about without kind of making a distinction between these groups and, as you said, more traditional patriarchal and so on, other groups. But some of the things I observed that I thought were really interesting were ways that they're sharing physical space with one another. So, in contrast to what I mentioned earlier about women being in the back or in a separate space or entering in a different room. In all of the communities I visited, men and women and, you know, non-binary Muslims all shared the same space. There, you know, there was mixed gender prayer. In various forms of leadership, there was at least an attempt to have some kind of shared authority where people were taking turns giving the sermon. I was also struck in a number of communities, Atlanta and Chicago, rather than having a sermon, they had kind of a communal conversation, which was something that was new to me. And sometimes that conversation, maybe for my benefit, but it would turn into a conversation about kind of what brought them to these groups or what they were getting out of it. So even though I wanted them to just do what they normally did and let me observe, sometimes they would turn those into talking about things that they thought I was interested in, which was really interesting. But I found that kind of event sometimes led to people telling stories about their past experiences and how they had felt excluded from other religious communities, and then what helped them feel more included, more welcomed, more sense of community within these progressive or non-conformist or inclusive spaces. I think El Tawhid has the most kind of elaborated ritual that they really try to stick to week after week. And kind of in line with what you were saying earlier about not departing from tradition, but creating new precedents. El Farouk in particular, who's one of the co-founders and current leaders, is very firm about telling people, making clear that their practices are based in tradition, even when, you know, if you just look at them from the outside, they might look quite different from what you would expect. And so things like, rather than requiring or encouraging everyone to do wudu before they come into the prayer space, they do dry tayammum together. And so that everyone can be included, even if they don't have access to the bathrooms or to clean water, or and so obviously that, you know, that practice of dry tayammum is coming from tradition, but they're repurposing it in a different way, you know, to meet their contemporary needs and to help with their project of inclusivity. Another example from there is the way in their name and in their physical use of space, having everyone sit in a circle, both before and after the prayer itself. So during the sermon and then again after the salat. So kind of creates a sense of equity, and also means that even if people tried to segregate by gender, it would be impossible because of the structure of the circle. Someone is always going to be sitting next to someone of a gender different from themselves. Yeah, so those are the examples that come to mind right now of how they're kind of enacting their spirituality. And then it came up into different extents in interviews. Some people talk more about their spirituality than others. Some were more focused on these issues of belonging and so on, like kind of being part of a group of other people rather than on their relationship with Allah. But for some people that was more important, and we did talk about that.
Yeah, that experience with the tayammum was new for me, and you know, gave me much food for thought for reasons not just related to queer identity, but also in terms of the female body and the different cycles and how people respond to that, and whether or not that is included in the ways in which we think about purity. You brought up, I just want to say, we're going to open up for a minute for chat to, you know, anyone who wants to join from the gallery, and to let the gallery know that if you are comfortable to open up your video and use your own voice, you're welcome to do that. Just that you know that eventually this will be posted public. If on the other hand, you are only comfortable with your voice and you don't want to use your video, that's fine. You will have that option. And then if you don't want to have either your voice or your video exposed at that level, you can put a question in the chat and, I will bring it forward. So allowing everyone to be at the comfort zone that is most amenable to, the way that they address these matters, because, not all of us are safe at all times in all places. So the last question that I want to ask, actually, I wanted to ask something about voice, so I might come back to it because, I like the way you engage in that and you mentioned it here, but you mentioned, and in the book, you talk, about authority. You also talk about some contentions with regard to consistencies and expressing shared authority. But I wanted to ask with regards to its relationship to two different prongs of authority that I see. And one is leadership. You see it functioning in these spaces and the extent to which they are successful at being able to share it. And the other is with regard to what I take from Khalid Abu Fadl about becoming a marker for the community conversation. So in other words, authority as, well, in a way as a voice, but I don't want to confuse it with some of the other things that I had on my mind with regard to voice, but authority as in the ability to be able to represent something not only to communities of Muslims, but also to communities, that are not Muslim, because the experience with authority that I had originally was hegemonic, patriarchal, neoconservative, and that's the only authority. So you have to be, what we used to say in Sisters in Islam, abdir din mullah, if you were not cis male, then you couldn't have any authority, and one of the ways in which Sisters in Islam and now Musawa try to change that narrative is to present lived reality as a form of authority in and of itself. So within the book, you don't deal with all that. I'm just saying why it was of interest to me. But in the book, you do talk about some contentions with regard to authority in relationship to leadership. And I just wanted you to share with us something about, your experience with that and your analysis of it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I didn't plan to include that part in the book initially. I was kind of encouraged by the external readers that the press sent the, first draft to, that they said I was describing these communities as if they were utopias, that they were all sort of marching toward being more inclusive and more progressive. And, they found that hard to believe that there were no contentions. And I realized that, I was aware of some contentions from my personal involvement, though they hadn't necessarily come up during, my visits to these groups or in my interviews. But there were a few that I was aware of. So I went back to two of the participants and ended up doing extensive interviews with them for the final chapter of the book about some critiques that they had of different aspects of these groups. So the one that you're referring to was from an African-American Muslim convert who has a lot of Islamic knowledge, has a graduate degree in Islamic studies, has studied Arabic and so on, and it has been involved in the progressive Muslim community for a number of years, and yet felt like she was being denied positions of leadership within the mosque that she was attending. And at the same time being asked to do kind of volunteer work that was not acknowledged in the way she felt like it should be. So the critique was about, this kind of utopian ideal of having shared authority where everyone gets to contribute in different ways, with the reality that there are certain people who are still deciding who gets invited to take on certain roles, whether that's giving a sermon or leading prayer, or, you know, taking on more kind of behind the scenes leadership in terms of vetting sermons and doing pastoral care and things like that. And there was some kind of hypothesizing that this may have something to do with gender, that in the particular mosque they were involved in, most of the leaders were male, and you know, leadership was, even though if you attend, you would see women leading prayer and giving the sermon many times, that the decision making was being controlled by men. I think from what I've observed kind of after my formal research ended, I can see that that particular group, perhaps independent of knowing about that critique, is making some strides in that regard, that they have kind of a new or expanded leadership team behind the scenes that is more diverse in terms of gender. And I hope, I mean, that was part of the book I was most nervous about putting out in the world, because, you know, it is people that I know well who are being critiqued. And I tried to handle that very carefully in terms of saying, like, yes, particular people are being named here, but the issues that are being critiqued really go beyond them. And these are just examples. So I haven't heard yet from those individuals, but I hope that they still want to be friends with me after they read that.
Yeah.
But I do see, you know, without being too utopian or idealistic about it, I do see some effort being made to make improvements there. And I think this project of being more inclusive, you know, is an ongoing project that these groups are always learning how to do it better. And that was the one of the things that I really appreciated, you know, in the chapter about Shia inclusivity and also about being more inclusive of non-binary people, was that in the conversations I recorded, people were very open about critiquing one another publicly and, you know, calling each other out in gentle ways, but, you know, that brought home the point that, you know, oh, the language that you just used doesn't feel right to me, doesn't include me. And then having kind of on the spot discussions about, oh, well, how can we do better? And like kind of working together to figure out the best way to use language and best way to be in community together. So I hope that those critiques are taken with that intention in mind of, like, you know, gentle push towards being more inclusive, towards doing even better the things that these groups are trying to do.
Yeah, there's no script for us, really. You know, we're just sort of winging it. And sometimes we, you know, I mean, we have to stop and check ourselves. I think in my experience in the last 20 years with, you know, queer Muslim inclusive spaces, there's still a predominance of gay males. And even amongst the trans participants, those who do the most, those who do have the most authority tend to be male to female trans persons. Like a lot fewer of the female to male trans persons are, you know, on the scene and visible. And I think, you know, we're a work in progress. Sort of reading your sign behind you. We're a work in progress. We're a work in progress, and you know, we need to keep working. I think if we ever decide that we have the formula, then that formula itself becomes authoritative and exclusive. So, you know, I think I want it to be a continual sort of merry-go-round where you get on and off, and sometimes you get on and you're on one of the horses that go up and down, and sometimes you're just sitting in one of those like park bench seats that's just still going around. And you know, because I love the idea of Islam as a living system, And as a living system, that means that, things are dynamic, and if, as soon as you fix them, then they, become rigid. And once they become rigid, then, as I said, they become exclusive, So, yeah, I do think that we're a work in progress. And that was one of the delights in reading your book, because I did, as I said, I got a view of communities, which I know very well, but your scholarly perspective on it, I think, was really insightful for me, because, I love utopia, and I tend to work in the idealized realms, just as a way of always setting a goal that in some ways is really unattainable.
Yeah.
If there are any questions or comments from the gallery, I want to open up to that possibility. If you want to share with us, you can just sort of indicate that you'd like to do so, and I would acknowledge you. Otherwise, I have lots of conversations that I can do, but just to make sure that we are at least allowing for that opportunity. Sometimes I'm on here with just the author, so it's fine for me, because I just love talking about, their works. Yeah, I also wanted to ask you, what's next for you? What are you working on now? And, how is that going?
Yeah, thank you. I'm starting a couple of new projects. One is an ethnography of a Muslim radio station in Tanga, Tanzania. So last summer I spent a few weeks there, kind of laying the groundwork and getting to know folks who run the station, getting their permission to go back and do research with them. And so this summer I'll go back for at least a couple of weeks. And I'm waiting to hear about funding to go for a longer period. And in the meantime, I'm working on a project that's more text-based on Swahili Islamic marital advice. I've been collecting these booklets. I'll share some examples. They're like from the 1930s all the way up through just a few years ago. And they're mostly written by men for men. Women's advice tends to be more oral, and I've written about that previously. But so I've been scanning. I have 20 something books. Been scanning them and kind of slowly working my way through them, reading them and analyzing the language use, as well as what kinds of advice was being given to men about how to be good Muslim husbands.
Yeah, those are always fun.
Yeah.
You have been in Wisconsin-Madison for how long at the university?
I've been here 10 years as a faculty member. I actually did my graduate studies here also. So I was here for 7 or 8 years, a long time ago doing that. And then in between I was teaching at UCLA. That was my first faculty job before I came back here.
Ah, okay. Yes. That's nice to know that you kind of have a home there. In other words, you're comfortable being there. And what about the reception and the sort of support for your work that you get in terms of just your faculty and everything? Is that working well for you?
Yeah, it's been interesting while working on this project, because I'm based in a department that's focused on Africa, and for the past 7 years I've been working on this project that has nothing to do with Africa. So I felt like a little bit of an outsider, but that has enabled me to make some connections with colleagues in other departments. I gotten involved in religious studies, as you mentioned, and anthropology and so on. So I think my work has become more interdisciplinary for that reason. And I've just been, reading more widely in all these other fields. I think the first draft of this book was really more anthropological and more linguistic. And then because someone suggested that I send it to the North American Religion series at NYU Press, the first batch of reader reviews was like, we really like this, but it's not really religious studies. And they suggested lots of readings to me that were in this whole other field that I had not really engaged with, just because my work has been so focused in East Africa. So that was really a learning curve for me and something I've really enjoyed. And I found the Department of Religious Studies here to be a really nice second home. And, it's interesting seeing the difference in the reception of this book compared to my previous two that were about Zimbabwe and Tanzania, that I think I'm not sure if it's because it's about North America or because it has the word queer in the title, but it's really reaching a much wider audience. And I'm hearing from many more people that, they've read it and loved it, or they want to read it. A friend told me she's going to buy it for her mother for Mother's Day. And so it's really gratifying. I've enjoyed the research that I did for all of the books, but it's, academic books don't always really get read. So it's nice to finally have written one that is getting such a nice reception.
Yeah, I do think it's an important contribution. I must admit, I have a bias. I think, I would have pursued reading this one, whereas I might not, even though, I also visited Zanzibar. I felt so at home there. People are sort of like my skin tone, and when the women dress, they kind of like look like me and everything. So I had, but I was there as a tourist, so there was no, sort of inside link or anything like that. But I probably wouldn't have pursued it to the same extent. And so, I do want to commend you on the contribution that I feel that you have made by this book, because, as I said, this, I think, is a very transformative time in the history of Islam and Muslims with regard to, queer identities. And one of the ways in which we sort of create new authority is by leaving a legacy of our own struggles with our intersecting identities, especially in terms of our spirituality and our gender identity. And it's really, your work is, very, you can tell it's very detailed. It's, laborious, the ways in which you have to sort of sit back and do the interviews, and at the same time, then go back and sort of present them without everything that you have in your data, obviously, it's like less than 200 pages. So, people who feel like, oh, there's just so much. You've covered so much, and you've done it so comprehensively. And also, it is a unique contribution in terms of what has been out there. There's a lot of, sort of ethnographic work that's not been done by people who actually have that as a discipline. So it's kind of like, a snapshot of something, and then they kind of elaborate on that, whereas you really do travel from community to community, and you talk about the dynamics between the communities, and you talk about the dynamics within the communities, and that allows people to have a view, and at the same time, you don't idealize, while at the same time, as I said, I do feel that you embody it with a kind of life and love that made it really easy for me to read it, and I enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed very much that you have come to share it with me. I look forward to everything else, and maybe one day we can hang out in the waters of Tanzania. I love. It was the first time I swam with the dolphins was off of Zanzibar. They just took us in a boat and just sort of like went for an hour offshore, and then at a certain point it just said jump. Jumped in the water, and there are the dolphins right there. It's like one of the peak moments of my life. So I definitely hope to return. Good luck with your ability to spend a year there. When that does happen, let me know, because that will be the time when I know that I can kind of sneak in there and
that would be wonderful.
I like meeting my North American friends in other places than in North American context. I'm not sure about Madison, Wisconsin, because you guys have serious winter over there, and I'm not really big on winters. So, any final words that you want to say for us?
I guess I want to encourage people to read the coda in particular, which you didn't mention. I think, as you mentioned, I have a lot of data that, I wasn't able to include all of it in the main parts of the book. So in the final part, I wrote this long kind of found poem using the words of the participants. And that is the part that I have shared the most with participants. Like I gave a sermon at Al Tawhid where I read that aloud to them, and people have really reacted positively to that, saying, they can hear themselves in it, sometimes literally if they were participants, and sometimes more metaphorically, and that it really represents kind of the range of experiences that people in these communities have. So I hope that even if folks don't read the whole book, they will read that and find themselves in it.
That was, I apologize because that's the part I think I kind of like skimmed over. Maybe I was wearing my academic hat and I was just trying to see what your analysis was. So I apologize for that. I'll go back and pay more attention to it. Thank you for making note of it, and thank you for sharing with us here, and for creating this work that is sure to have an impact, on the ways in which, queer realities are incorporated in Islamic realities. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a good night.